The morning after the city turned gold, Luca Moretti made espresso. Not the kind his assistant made. Not the kind that arrived on a silver tray at 7:15 every morning of his professional life. Prepared by someone whose job it was to anticipate his needs before he named them. He made it himself, in the kitchen, at 5:17 in the morning, in the specific unhurried way his father had taught him in a different kitchen in a different life. The kind that took 20 minutes to do properly, the kind you didn't rush, the kind that was less about coffee and more about the decision to do something careful for someone you love before the world asked anything of either of you. He set it on the counter beside the stove where she would find it when she woke up. Then he stood in the kitchen in the early quiet and looked at the cup for a long time. He was not a man given a ceremony. He was not a man who assigned meaning to small gestures or read significance into ordinary moments. He had spent 8 years deliberately excising that tendency from himself because sentimentality was a liability and liabilities got people killed in his world, and he had been very committed for a very long time to staying alive and staying focused and staying exactly the person the plan required him to be. He looked at the cup of espresso on the counter. He thought, my father did this every morning for 30 years. He thought, I understand now why. He went to get dressed for a meeting he no longer cared about in the way he used to care about things, and behind him the espresso sat on the counter in the early gold of a new morning, waiting for a woman with paint on her jaw and bare feet, and a copy of Neruda she'd read until the spine gave out. And it was the most honest thing Luca Moretti had done in 8 years. And he knew it. She found it at 6:45. She came into the kitchen in his gray cashmere sweater and bare feet, her magnificent spiral coils loose and sleep-soft around her face, moving through the kitchen with the unhurried ease of a woman who had decided she lived somewhere and was simply acting accordingly. She was thinking about the ocean painting. She had been thinking about it since she woke up. There was something in the waves she still hadn't gotten right, some quality of the dark water she kept reaching for and kept missing by a fraction she couldn't name. She was thinking about Prussian blue versus ivory black in the deep water when she saw the espresso. She stopped. It was in the small ceramic cup she had mentioned once in passing 3 weeks ago in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, that she preferred for espresso. The dark blue one with a thin gold rim. She had said it almost to herself, the way she said most things that mattered, without fanfare, without expecting to be heard. He had heard. She stood in the kitchen at 6:45 in the morning looking at the small dark blue cup with the thin gold rim and felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. Not love, or not only love, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the specific territory of being known, of being heard without asking to be heard, of someone paying the kind of attention that costs something. She picked up the cup. The espresso was still warm. She stood at the kitchen window watching the city wake up below and drank it slowly, and her eyes were very bright, and she didn't try to make them less so, because there was no one watching, and she had long ago decided that the feelings that arrived without permission were the only ones worth keeping. He came home that evening to find a painting on the kitchen counter. Not a large one. Small, the size of a hardcover book, painted on a piece of cardboard she had clearly cut from one of the supply boxes in the studio. The edges slightly uneven, the kind of surface you use when you have something you need to paint immediately and the proper materials are beside the point. She had painted the kitchen. Their kitchen at 5 in the morning, in the specific blue gold of pre-dawn, with a small dark ceramic cup on the counter and the city glowing through the window behind it. She had painted the espresso. She had not signed it. She had left it on the counter where the cup had been, leaning against the backsplash, and she was not in the kitchen when he found it. She was in the studio. He could hear the faint movement of her in there, and he stood at the kitchen counter holding this small, unframed painting on cardboard and felt something happen in his chest that he was, by now, beginning to recognize. He was beginning to recognize it the way you recognize a language you spoke as a child and forgot, and are slowly remembering. Haltingly, imperfectly, with the particular emotion of recovering something you didn't know you'd lost. He carried the painting to the studio doorway. She was at the easel, working, her magnificent 4C afro lit from the north window, two paintbrushes pushed through it at different angles. Cobalt blue smock paint scattered in colors he was starting to be able to name. She had her back to him, and she didn't turn around, but her shoulders did something that told him she knew he was there. "You painted the espresso," he said. "You made it," she said without turning. "Someone should." He looked at the painting in his hands, at the small, careful rendering of a cup on a counter in early light, at the thing she had made from the thing he had done, the way she made things from everything, found the beauty in it, the significance, painted it into permanence before it could be ordinary. "Elena," he said. She turned then, looked at him across the studio in the north light with her enormous dark eyes and her paint-scattered face and the beauty mark above her lip and the complete, steady, open attention she gave to everything she considered worth her time. "I know," she said quietly. He crossed the room. He didn't say anything else. He put his forehead against hers the way he had learned to do. This gesture that had become, without either of them deciding it, the specific language of everything too large for words between them. And they stood in the north light with the city below them, and the ocean painting watching from the wall, and the small cardboard painting still in his hands. She smelled like linseed oil and coffee and something warm he had no word for. He thought, 30 years. He thought it clearly and without panic, which was how he knew it was true. The espresso, the painting, the forehead. He's thinking 30 years, and he hasn't said a word. Follow for what comes next, because something is coming that neither of them is prepared for. And neither are you. Asterisk, asterisk. The second month of the marriage didn't start with a fight. It started with a gift that felt like an ultimatum. Nobody announced it. Nobody declared it. It arrived the way all the most important shifts in Luca Moretti's life arrived. Quietly, incrementally, in the space between one thing and another, visible only in retrospect, when you looked back and tried to identify the exact moment the ground changed beneath you. What changed was this. He started coming home earlier. Not dramatically. Not in the way of a man making a declaration or correcting a pattern he had identified and decided to address. Just earlier. The 11:30 p.m. risotto dinners became 10 p.m. and then 9 p.m. and then, without either of them marking the transition, 8 p.m. He would come through the door in his suit and his silver cufflinks and sit in the living room chair that faced the city, and he would stay. He didn't explain it. She didn't ask. But the smell of oil paint drifted down the hallway from the north studio, and the faint sound of a brush moving across canvas reached him where he sat. And Luca Moretti, who had spent the better part of a decade perfecting the precise and deliberate art of being unreachable, of existing in rooms without being present in them, of building such complete emotional distance between himself and everything that the distance had become indistinguishable from who he was, sat in his living room chair and listened to the sound of her working and felt, without quite admitting it, anchored. He was anchoring himself to a hallway, to the sound of a brush on canvas, to the particular quality of presence that was Elena in her studio at night, completely absorbed, completely herself, entirely unbothered by being in a room adjacent to the most dangerous man in the Syndicate. He sat with his scotch and the city blazing below and the brush sounds drifting down the hall, and he thought, with the clarity that arrived only in the honest hours of the evening, this is the most dangerous thing I have ever done. Not the revenge, not the 8 years, not the boardroom or the council table or the dark rooms where the real conversations happened. This sitting in a chair, listening to someone work, letting it matter. He poured a second scotch and didn't drink it either. The small things accumulated the way small things do when you're not watching for them, which is to say completely. She started leaving her Neruda on the kitchen counter, dog-eared to whatever page she was living in that week, and he started reading the marked pages before he moved the book, which she noticed because she started marking different pages, more specific ones, the ones she thought he needed, and neither of them ever mentioned this exchange that was happening in the margins of their evenings. She found, in the third week of November, that he had memorized how she took her tea. Not her coffee. She always made her own coffee, precisely the French press ritual she performed every morning with the focus of someone who considered the quality of the first cup a matter of genuine importance. Her tea. The cup she made at 9 in the evening when she was winding down from the studio, one particular blend of rooibos and something floral she had brought with her from the Connecticut estate in a small tin that was running low. He had ordered more. She found a new tin in the cabinet one Thursday evening, 3 times the size of the original, and she stood holding it in the kitchen for a long moment before putting it on the shelf. She said nothing about it. He said nothing about it. But that evening she brought 2 cups to the living room without being asked, and set one beside him where he sat with the city and the scotch he never finished, and sat on the far end of the sofa with her own cup and her Neruda, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind they had been building together since the first midnight kitchen and had never once had to discuss. Because the comfortable silence was not a thing you built by talking about it. He reached across and took the tea. She turned a page. The city blazed outside. This was the gift. This was what the second month was, this slow, unannounced, completely ordinary accumulation of being known and knowing. Of the bookshelf reorganized by color, and the team memorized, and the Neruda read in the margins. Of him in the living room listening to the brush sounds, and her in the studio knowing he was there. It felt for the first time in a very long time like something worth protecting, which was, of course, precisely when the Syndicate reminded him that he wasn't allowed to have things worth protecting. The tea. He memorized how she took her tea and ordered more of it and said nothing. If that detail just did something to you, stay. Because this is exactly the moment the story pivots. And the pivot is coming fast, asterisk asterisk. It happened on a rainy Tuesday. Elena was in the studio, lost in what she had started calling the North Light series. 3 canvases she was working simultaneously, all studies of the same quality of light at different hours, an obsessive methodical project that she had begun without announcement and was pursuing with the focused devotion she gave to everything she decided mattered. She was working on the second canvas, the 4 p.m. light, when the heavy oak door opened. Luca didn't enter. He stood in the frame. His coat was still wet from outside. His hair was slightly less perfect than usual, the November rain having done something to it that his usual precision hadn't accounted for. And his face was a mask of such terrifying neutrality that Elena felt the air leave the room. She had spent 2 months learning the vocabulary of his face. She knew his expressions now the way she knew the ocean painting. Not perfectly, not completely, but well enough to read the thing underneath the surface. What was underneath the surface of his face in the studio doorway on that rainy Tuesday was not anger, not coldness, not the professional blankness he wore in boardrooms. It was fear, controlled, immaculate, barely perceptible, but fear. The specific fear of a man who has identified a threat to something he did not plan to care about and cares about anyway. She didn't put down her palette. "You need to stay away from the windows," he said. His voice was a flat line. She looked at him steadily. "It's a penthouse, Luca. The windows are the point. The point has changed." He walked into the room, and for the first time since the studio existed, Since the first time he had stood in this doorway watching her paint his hands, since every time he had crossed this floor to brush paint from her jaw, he did not look at the art. He looked at her, specifically at her neck, the graceful long neck she always left bare when she was working, with the attention of a man checking for something he desperately does not want to find. The Syndicate found out about the studio, he said. They found out I cleared the north-facing glass. They know where you stand to paint. The room went very quiet. He held out his hand, and it was a small, crushed piece of charcoal. Her charcoal, she recognized it immediately, the way the end had been worn at an angle from use. The piece she had left on the East Terrace 3 weeks ago on an afternoon, she had taken her sketchbook outside and sat in the October light, drawing the city. She had left it there when she came back inside and forgotten it and had not thought about it again. It had been delivered to his office that afternoon in a small box lined with black silk. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than any they had shared before. Not comfortable, not charged with unspoken feeling. This was the silence of something real and external entering a space that had been, until this moment, entirely their own. They aren't coming for the money anymore. Elena, he said, his voice dropping to something quieter and more terrible than anything loud. He stepped into her space, close, the smell of rain and November and expensive wool overwhelming the turpentine and linseed oil, and his dark eyes on her face had the quality of a man taking inventory of something he is terrified of losing. They're coming for the masterpiece. She understood. She understood that he did not mean the paintings. A piece of her charcoal, delivered to his office, in a box lined with black silk. He said they're coming for the masterpiece, and he didn't mean the paintings. Subscribe, because what happens next takes place at 3 a.m. in a kitchen, and it will take you apart piece by piece. Asterisk, asterisk. That night, the comfortable silence was gone. The penthouse felt sealed, pressurized. He had doubled the guards, and the terrace doors had new locks, and the north studio felt different now that she knew someone had noted what its windows illuminated. She ate dinner alone. He was on calls. She could hear the low, measured cadence of his voice from the study, the particular flatness it went when he was in operational mode, which was a different voice from any she had cataloged. She ate her pasta and read Neruda, and when she got to the poem about spring and cherry trees, she stopped and looked at it for a long time. I want to do with you what spring does with the cherry trees. She had told him once that it was terrifying because it meant changing someone. He had asked what happened if the cherry tree got a choice. She had said, then the poem means something completely different. She sat at the kitchen island alone at 9 o'clock with the poem and thought about choices, about the tea he had memorized and the tin he had replaced without saying so, about the brush sounds he listened to from the hallway and the Neruda he read in the margins, about all the small things that had accumulated in the second month, like a language being built between two people who hadn't agreed to build it and had built it anyway, about what it cost a man like Luca to let any of that be true. She went to bed without seeing him. She woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of the kitchen. She found him there making espresso. He was facing the counter with his back to the doorway, still in his dress shirt from the day, sleeves rolled, collar open, silver watch catching the low light, and he was making the espresso the way she had never seen him make it before. Not the unhurried, patient way of the morning after the city turned gold. Not the careful, deliberate way that was less about coffee and more about a reason to stay in the room. He was making it frantically. The movements were precise. His movements were always precise, but there was something underneath the precision that was not controlled. A barely perceptible urgency. The quality of a man trying to outrun his own shadow by keeping his hands busy. He was making fuel, not espresso, and the difference was everything. You're doing it wrong, she said. He didn't turn around. I know how to make coffee, Elena. You know how to make fuel, she said. Your father didn't make fuel. He made a reason to stay in the room. She crossed the kitchen in her silk robe and bare feet, her magnificent spiral coils loose around her face, gold bangles soft at her wrist, and she put her hand over his on the counter. Just placed it there, warm and steady and without condition, the same way she had placed it over his hand on the marble island that first midnight when she asked about the espresso mornings, the gesture that had no translation except, I am here, and I am not leaving, and you do not have to hold this alone. He stopped. The frantic precision stopped completely. He looked down at her hand over his, her deep mahogany skin against his lighter complexion, the thin gold ring on her right middle finger, the faint trace of Prussian blue paint permanently ghosted at the edge of her thumb, her 3 stacked gold bangles resting warm against his wrist, and something happened in the line of his shoulders that she had only seen once before. The night he talked about the espresso mornings. The night the room he had kept locked for 8 years opened. I can't lose this, he said. His voice broke on it. Not dramatically, not loudly. The way stone breaks when water has been working at it for long enough. A fracture so precise and so complete that it seemed almost like a door opening rather than a wall falling. She kept her hand over his and gave him the rest of it in his own time. I built this entire life to take back what was stolen, he said. 8 years. Every decision, every alliance, every room I walked into, all of it pointed at the same thing. I thought I knew exactly what I was building. A pause. The city moved outside the windows in its indifferent enormity. I didn't know that by taking you, by using you for the plan, I was giving them the only thing that could actually destroy me. She understood. She understood that he was not talking about leverage. He was talking about what it would cost him to lose her. About the discovery, arriving tonight via a black silk box with a piece of crushed charcoal inside it, that somewhere in the espresso mornings and the midnight kitchens and the team memorized and the Neruda read in the margins, something had become non-negotiable to him that he had never planned to allow to become non-negotiable. And the discovery of that fact in the context of a direct threat was the most frightening thing that had ever happened to him. More frightening than the Syndicate. More frightening than 8 years. Because 8 years he had been prepared for. This he had not. She didn't pull away. She leaned in, moved her body into his space the way she moved through all his spaces without apology, without seeking permission, and rested her forehead against his shoulder. The silk of her robe against his dress shirt. The warmth of her against the November cold still in him from somewhere he hadn't told her about. Then stop fighting them like a Don, she said quietly. Not a whisper. She never whispered things she meant. Just quiet. The specific quietness of something being said once and not needing to be repeated. Start fighting them like a man who has something worth keeping. Luca turned. His hands found her waist. Found it the way her hand found his in the dark, without needing to look, with the certainty of something that had been true longer than either of them had admitted. And he pulled her in. Not with the polished, controlled precision of the Gilded Don. With the hard, desperate honesty of a man who has been performing safety for 8 years and has just admitted in the low light of his own kitchen at 3 a.m. that performance and safety are not the same thing and never were. He looked at her, really looked, the way she had taught him to look at things, not for information, not for assessment, not for leverage, for what was actually there. What was actually there in the low amber kitchen light was extraordinary. She was looking back at him with her enormous dark eyes completely steady, her magnificent coils loose around her face, the beauty mark above her lip, the Prussian blue ghost on her thumb, the silk robe and the bare feet and the gold bangles, and the complete unperformed calm of a woman who had looked at this man clearly from the very first moment and had never once flinched at what she saw. The sad eyes were not looking at the past. They were looking at her. I'm going to have to do things, Elena. His voice had the quality of a confession made not to receive absolution, but because the truth had become too heavy to hold without witnesses. Things that will make you look at me and see the monster your father told you I was. Luca. Her voice was steady. I have spent 24 years in this world. I have spent 24 years looking at men who confuse power with personhood and cruelty with strength and control with love. She held his gaze without flinching. I know what a monster looks like. She reached up and touched his face. One hand against his jaw. The jaw everyone else read as severity, and she had always read as something underneath severity, something older and more honest. I think I know how to recognize a man, she said. He kissed her then, not with the polished grace of the Gilded Don, not the studio kiss, the long-held release of months of careful restraint. This was different. This was the starving, urgent honesty of a man who has just realized that the window he thought he was looking through was actually a mirror, that what he has been protecting was never the plan or the legacy or the seat, that what was delivered to his office today in a box lined with black silk was a message about the only thing that actually mattered. And the message landed because the thing actually mattered, and he could no longer pretend otherwise. She kissed him back with both hands on his face. She always kissed him back with both hands on his face, like she was holding something she had decided to keep. They stayed in the kitchen until the espresso was cold and the city shifted from deep night to the first gray suggestion of almost morning. She made the espresso again, properly this time, unhurried, patient, the way it was supposed to be made, and they sat at the kitchen island with their cups and the low light and the city going gray, and he told her what he was going to do. Not the tactical specifics, the shape of it. The decision that had arrived somewhere between the black silk box and the studio doorway, and this kitchen at 3 in the morning with her hand over his. He was going to stop playing the game the way the Syndicate had written the rules. He was going to burn the table down. She listened the way she always listened, with her whole body, asking the real questions, the ones underneath the logistical ones. What happens to us, she said, while you're doing it? He looked at her across the kitchen island in the almost morning. Everything I do from this point forward, he said, is so that there's an us to come back to. She was quiet for a moment. She turned the dark blue cup with the gold rim in her hands. The cup he always reached for when he was making hers. Okay, she said. Just that. Okay. The complete, unbothered, entirely serious okay of a woman who has heard what she needed to hear and is ready. That's it, he said. Okay. She looked at him with her enormous dark eyes. You told me the truth on our wedding day, she said. You've told me the truth every time since. I know who you are, Luca. I know what this world is. She set down her cup. I'm not asking you to make it something else. I'm asking you to come back to this kitchen when it's done. He reached across the island and covered her hand with his. I will always come back to this kitchen, he said. She turned her hand over and held his back. Outside the city was going gold. I will always come back to this kitchen. He said it like a vow, like the real one, the one nobody heard at the altar. Subscribe, because part 3 is where Luca calls a council meeting he has no intention of attending as a member. Elena discovers something in the studio that changes everything she thought she knew about her own father, and the Gilded Don decides to burn the table down instead of sitting at it. Don't find out from someone else how this ends. Asterisk, asterisk. That night he sat in the studio after she'd gone to bed. He sat in her chair, the low wooden one she pulled to the easel, and looked at the ocean painting in the dark. The painting she had been working on since Amalfi at 17. The one she had finally gotten right last month in a moment that arrived almost by accident, the way the right things always did. He looked at it for a long time. The waves were exactly right. He could see that now, in a way he hadn't been able to see before tonight, before the black silk box and the studio doorway and the kitchen at 3 in the morning. The dark water had a quality he hadn't had a word for before and had one for now. The painting looked like a decision. The waves weren't violent. They were the ocean doing the thing the ocean did, moving, dark, enormous, completely itself, indifferent to whether anyone was watching. The painting looked like something that had decided what it was and was entirely at rest inside that decision. He sat in her chair in the dark studio and understood, for the first time, what she had been painting all along. Not the ocean, the choice to be itself. He thought about his father choosing rest, about Elena choosing softness in a world designed to sand it away, about himself, the Gilded Don, the architect, the man who had built an empire out of grief, and the discipline of someone who has decided revenge is a reasonable substitute for living. Choosing for the first time something else, not instead of everything he had built. Alongside it, he got up from the chair. He went back to the bedroom. Elena was asleep on her side, facing his side of the bed, one hand resting on his pillow, not reaching, not searching, just resting there in the unconscious way of someone who has gotten used to a presence and orients toward it even in sleep. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her hand on his pillow. Then he got into bed. She made a small sound in her sleep and turned toward him without waking, her hand finding his chest, settling over his heart, where it always went, with the complete, unhurried certainty of someone who knew exactly where things were and reached for them without needing to look. He put his hand over hers. Outside the city burned its endless gold. Inside the room was dark and quiet and completely full. He closed his eyes. He thought, 30 years, not as a sentence, not as a plan or an aspiration or a decision announced to anyone, as a fact already in progress, as a thing already decided and already underway and already, in the most important sense, already true. He held her hand against his heart. Outside, somewhere in the city, the Syndicate was already moving. Inside, in the dark, Luca was already ready. He slept. She found his hand in the dark while she was asleep. Her hand just knew where to go. And outside, the Syndicate was already moving. If this story has lived in your chest, if you felt something in these pages that you recognize, you know what to do. Follow. Subscribe. Save every part. Share it with someone who needs a love story that doesn't flinch. Part 3 is coming. And it begins with Luca walking into a room he plans to burn down, and Elena finding something in the studio that will shatter everything she thought she knew about her own father. You need to be there. Asterisk, asterisk.